The kind of Monday that Chicago does best arrived without warning or mercy. A gray wall of cloud pressed down on the city like a lid on a pot, sealing in the cold and the diesel exhaust and the quiet dread of a week that hadn't yet begun. On the lakefront, the waves ran low and irritable. Cabs on Michigan Avenue spat through puddles without slowing. The city moved the way cities move when they want to remind you they were here long before you and will be here long after. On the 50th floor of Atlas Global Tower, none of that mattered. Up here, the world was glass and steel and recycled air, and the particular silence of a building that knows it costs more per square foot than most people earn in a month. The conference room designated Atlas 7 occupied the northeast corner, floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, a mahogany table long enough to land a small aircraft, and 14 leather chairs, arranged with geometric precision. 8 of those chairs were occupied. At the head of the table, Eleanor Hayes sat with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that movement signals weakness. 51 years old, silver-streaked hair pulled back with surgical severity, a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Eleanor had built Atlas Global from a 2-room import consultancy into a 48-country infrastructure firm by being, as one industry profile once put it, constitutionally incapable of losing. She had stared down sovereign debt crises, hostile takeovers, and a congressional subpoena. She had never, not once, been in a room where she did not understand what was being said, until this morning. Across the table, the international delegation had arrived the previous evening from 4 continents. Friedrich Baumann, lead negotiator for the German Infrastructure Consortium, sat rigid in his chair, a man carved from expectation and impatience. Beside him, Yuki Tanaka from the Tokyo Development Authority watched the room with the kind of attentiveness that doesn't blink. Paulo Salave, representing a Brazilian municipal coalition, had spent the last 40 minutes staring at his phone in a way that said he was calculating flight times. The remaining 5 delegates representing interests in Qatar, Shanghai, Lagos, Seoul, and Ottawa occupied a spectrum from politely confused to openly restless. $3 billion. That was the number at the center of the table, unspoken but present in every silence. A cross-continental infrastructure project. Data corridors, logistics networks, port development frameworks. The kind of deal that takes 18 months to mature and can collapse in a single morning if the right words fail to travel across the right cultural distance. Today, the words were failing badly. The 12th interpreter, a sharp-faced woman from a translation agency on the Gold Coast, third-language specialist, flown in on 36 hours' notice, had just delivered her resignation from the assignment with remarkable dignity. She had set her earpiece on the table, folded her hands, and said in a clear, professional voice, "I'm not confident I'm serving this negotiation well. I'd rather be honest about that now." No one argued with her. Eleanor studied the remaining faces across the table. Friedrich Baumann was checking his watch with the pointed theatricality of a man who had reserved the gesture for precisely this moment. Paulo Salave had stopped staring at his phone and was now staring at the ceiling, which was worse. She turned to Marcus, her head of operations, who stood at the back wall like a man waiting for a verdict. "Find me another interpreter," she said. Marcus's expression did not move. That was the last one. The room absorbed this. At the far end of the table, Friedrich Baumann spoke. His English was precise, deliberate, and currently carrying all the warmth of a February wind off Lake Michigan. "I have a call scheduled with Frankfurt at 11 o'clock, he said. "If this negotiation is not substantively progressing by that time, I will inform my principals that the partnership is not viable." Eleanor held his gaze. "I understand." "I do not believe you do," Friedrich said, not unkindly. "We came a very long way to be misunderstood." The service corridor outside Atlas 7 was not designed for human contemplation. It was designed for mops, supply carts, electrical junction boxes, and the quiet movement of people who weren't supposed to be noticed. A strip of fluorescent lighting ran overhead. The carpet was industrial gray, the kind that shows nothing and forgives everything. Daniel Brooks had been working this corridor since 6 in the morning. He was 34 years old, though he looked, on most mornings, like a man who had been 34 for a very long time. Not old, the word wasn't right. Worn in the way a well-used thing is worn. Honestly, without apology. He had his mother's jaw and his father's height, and a pair of dark eyes that tended to notice things. Right now they were tracking the baseboards along the east wall, which the previous shift had missed. The cart beside him held 3 grades of cleaning solution, 2 rolls of paper towels, a mop he'd named nothing because naming things at work felt like a particular kind of defeat he wasn't ready for, and a wireless earbud through which, at this precise moment, a recorded voice was conjugating Portuguese verbs in the imperfect subjunctive. Tivesse, the voice said. If I had had. Se eu tivesse tido. Daniel repeated the phrase under his breath without stopping his work. His lips moved. The broom kept its rhythm. He had been doing this learning languages in the margins of his life for 6 years. Not in classrooms, not in immersion programs, not in the comfortable infrastructure of formal education, in parking structures during lunch breaks, on the L train at 5 in the morning. In the hour between Emma falling asleep and the point when his own exhaustion became non-negotiable. Language as something you steal in pieces because you can no longer afford to pursue it whole. He had been a scholarship student at the University of Pennsylvania. Linguistics. A full ride. A faculty advisor who called him one of the most naturally gifted students she'd encountered in 2 decades of teaching, and a future that had seemed, for a brief period, as straightforward as a line drawn with a ruler. Then Carrie got sick. The details of those 18 months were not the kind Daniel revisited casually. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed when Emma was 18 months old. The math of it had been swift and brutal. Treatment costs that ate through their savings in 90 days. A health insurance policy with gaps in it that seemed designed specifically for catastrophes of this magnitude. A decision point arrived at one night in a hospital waiting room that reduced itself to a single sentence. Someone needed to keep the power on and the rent paid and the pediatrician appointments kept. Someone needed to be the thing that didn't break. Daniel had left Penn in the fall semester of his junior year. He had never gone back. Carrie died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. Emma had been 5. Daniel had held his daughter in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before either of them could speak. He did not allow himself to think about Carrie too much on working days. It didn't help anything, and Emma needed a father who could function. The job at Atlas Global Tower paid $22 an hour, included health insurance for dependents, allowed him to work the early morning shift in by 5, out by 1:30 so that he could be at the school gate by 3. It was not what he had imagined his life would be. It was what his life was. He had made a quiet, private peace with the distance between those two things, and he policed the borders of that peace carefully. Emma was 8 now, with her mother's laugh and a tendency to ask questions that dismantled his composure more thoroughly than anything else on earth. Last week she had come home from school carrying a library book about polyglots, people who speak many languages, and had placed it on the kitchen table during dinner with the gravity of a judge presenting evidence. "Daddy," she had said, "it says here some people speak more than 20 languages. That's more than you." She had paused. "You should catch up." He had laughed so hard he'd spilled his coffee. The conference room doors were floor-to-ceiling glass panels, frosted at the edges, clear at the center. If you were working the service corridor and you paused at the right angle, you could see through to the table. The delegates, the careful choreography of people trying to reach each other across distances that weren't entirely geographic. Daniel wasn't trying to look, but he heard. The conference room was not soundproofed in the way most people assumed. Atlas Global's architects had prioritized the impression of transparency, that glass, those clean sightlines over acoustic privacy. Sound moved through the panels in a low, muffled register, enough that the exact content was blurred but the shape of a conversation was preserved. Daniel had been working this floor for 11 months. He knew the shape of a deal going wrong. He set his equipment cart against the wall and stood for a moment, not thinking about it, just listening the way he'd listened to language tapes for years, with the part of the mind that processes pattern before meaning. He caught a phrase in Mandarin. Then its English rendering, from the interpreter, or rather, from whoever had most recently attempted that role. He closed his eyes. The Mandarin phrase had been, Yix Walman Kaya Kola Gangling Hu de Fangsi. It was a standard diplomatic softener. Perhaps we might consider a more flexible approach. It was the linguistic equivalent of a held-out hand. It was not a demand. It was not a refusal. It was an invitation to negotiate. The English version that had apparently been rendered. They are saying that the current terms are unacceptable. Daniel opened his eyes. He knew what that kind of translation did to a room. He had studied it academically, the collapse of negotiations through mistranslation, the wars that had started over misrendered phrases, the deals that had died because a diplomatic hedge had been rendered as an ultimatum. He had written a paper on it in his second year at Penn. Professor Aldrich had given it an A and told him, with characteristic directness, that if he kept thinking this way, he'd end up doing something that mattered. Through the glass, he could see the German delegate, the rigid one, the one with the Frankfurt deadline, speaking now. The body language was clear enough without translation. A man who had decided something and was communicating it with finality. Daniel caught another fragment, Arabic, this time. A phrase from the Qatari delegate, something about trust and process. A phrase that contained the word amana, a concept that didn't translate cleanly into English at all, something closer to sacred trust or a debt of honor. A word that in this context was almost certainly being used to signal that the speaker's principles had committed themselves beyond the point of casual renegotiation. He didn't know what the interpreter had done with it. He didn't need to. The Japanese delegate was now speaking. Yuki Tanaka's voice was low, careful, each sentence constructed with the kind of precision that Daniel recognized as keigo, the formal register that Japanese uses for interactions of extreme social significance, a register that says, among other things, I am taking this seriously and I expect you to know that. The interpreter's rendering, as best he could hear it. Daniel looked at the mop in his hand. Then he looked at the doors. He thought about Emma. He thought about the health insurance card in his wallet, the one that had paid for Emma's ear infection in January and her asthma prescription, and the follow-up appointment with the pediatric specialist at Rush that had cost, before insurance, $800. He thought about the mortgage on the apartment in Lincoln Square that was $300 a month cheaper than any other neighborhood where Emma's school was, and about the savings account that had a number in it that was still smaller than comfortable. He thought about risk. He thought about what you lose when you step through a door you're not supposed to open. Then Friedrich Baumann's voice came through the glass, flat and final. In 10 minutes, I call Frankfurt. This deal is over. Daniel set the mop against the wall. He stood at the door for 4 seconds. That was how long it took him to run the calculation that had no clean answer. The risk of acting against the certainty of regret if he didn't. He had spent 6 years becoming invisible. He had grown expert at it, moving through rooms where decisions happened, doing his work without friction or acknowledgement, making himself as unremarkable as a piece of furniture. It was a survival skill. It had kept Emma in school shoes and kept the lights on, and kept him employed in the one job that offered the particular constellation of benefits his life required. 4 seconds. He knocked. The sound was quieter than he'd intended. He knocked again, more firmly, and pushed the door open. 14 heads turned. The silence had a texture to it. He was aware. In the clinical way, you become aware of things when the adrenaline is running, of exactly how the room read him. The gray maintenance shirt with the small Atlas Global Tower logo on the breast pocket, the cleaning cart visible behind him in the corridor, the particular posture of a man who has spent 11 months learning to take up minimum space, Eleanor Hayes was looking at him the way a person looks at something that has appeared where it has no business appearing. Not with anger yet, but with the precursor to anger, the cold assessment that precedes it. "This room is occupied," she said. "I know," Daniel said. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I can help with your translation problem." The room absorbed this. Marcus, the operations director, moved away from the wall with the purposeful trajectory of a man about to manage a situation. Daniel kept his eyes on Eleanor. "You're the janitor," she said. It was not a question. It was a category. "Yes," Daniel said. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I work the morning shift on 50 through 53. He paused. "I also speak Mandarin, Arabic, Portuguese, German, French, Japanese, Spanish, and English. I've been listening through the door for about 10 minutes. I know what's happening in this room and I think I can help you fix it." Someone laughed. It came from the direction of the operations side of the table, short, involuntary. The kind that escapes before social judgment can catch it. Several other faces shifted between surprise and skepticism and the particular discomfort of people who are running out of options but don't yet want to admit it. Friedrich Baumann was not laughing. He was watching Daniel with the unreadable expression of a German engineer who has decided to collect one more data point before drawing a conclusion. Eleanor Hayes had not moved. 8 languages, she said. 8, Daniel confirmed. "Learned how?" "The long way," he said. "Scholarship in linguistics at Penn." "I didn't finish. I've been continuing on my own." Marcus arrived at his shoulder. "Mr. Brooks, let him speak." It was Yuki Tanaka. Her English, Daniel noted, was excellent, precise, accented, entirely composed. She was watching him with something that was not skepticism. "I would like to hear what he says." Eleanor looked at Yuki for a moment. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Come in," she said. Daniel stepped through the door and stood at the near end of the table, not taking a seat he hadn't been offered one, and he understood the geometry of the moment too well to claim space that wasn't his yet. "I'll start with what I heard," he said. He turned toward the Chinese delegation. He spoke in Mandarin, clearly, at a register slightly more formal than conversational, but not the stiff, ceremonial formal that sounds artificial to native ears. He said, "I apologize for the interruption. I want to explain what I believe went wrong in the last hour, if that would be acceptable." The lead delegate from Shanghai, a man in his 60s, named, as Daniel had inferred from the name placard, Chen Wei, looked up with an expression that shifted from surprise through something more complex. He responded in Mandarin. "You speak well. Thank you. Not perfectly, but well enough, I hope." Daniel turned back to the room. "Mr. Chen was not rejecting the proposed timeline earlier," he said to Eleanor. He was using a standard diplomatic phrase, one that signals willingness to continue negotiating. The phrase was rendered as a refusal. It wasn't one. He let that sit for a moment. Then he turned to the Qatari delegate, Dr. Rania al-Rashid, according to her placard, a name he recognized as one that carried a specific regional authority. He spoke Arabic. "The concept you raised, Amana, I want to make sure it was understood correctly. Were you communicating that your principal's commitment exists outside of negotiable terms? That it has, in effect, already been given as a promise?" Dr. al-Rashid stared at him. In Arabic, "That is exactly what I was saying. For 40 minutes. I understand. I'll make sure the room understands it correctly." He explained to the table what Amana meant, not just the definition, but the cultural weight of the word, the way it carried a different gravity in the context of a Gulf business relationship than commitment or pledge would suggest to a Western legal framework. He watched the faces change as the explanation landed. Eleanor's jaw shifted slightly. Friedrich Baumann uncrossed his arms. "This," Friedrich said slowly, "is what we have been missing." "Yes," Daniel said. "Language isn't just words. It's the room that the words live in." Some of what's been lost this morning isn't vocabulary, it's architecture. He moved around the table without hurrying, without performing. He asked questions. He rendered answers. He did not simply translate, he contextualized, flagging when a phrase needed cultural scaffolding before it could carry its full meaning across the table. When Paulo Salave used a Brazilian Portuguese expression that had no direct English equivalent, one that roughly described the productive tension between a firm position and genuine willingness to move, Daniel unpacked it, slowly, finding the idea behind the idiom rather than reaching for a substitute. When Yuki Tanaka spoke in Keigo, he did not flatten it into simple English. He said, "Miss, Tanaka is communicating in a formal register that, in Japanese business culture, signals that she is speaking on behalf of her institution at the highest level of commitment. This is not casual. This is the voice she uses when her organization has made a considered decision." Yuki nodded once, precisely, in a way that said, "Yes, that." The room's temperature changed in the way rooms change when the air pressure finally equalizes, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with a kind of collective exhale, a release of something that had been held too long. Marcus, from the back wall, was watching Daniel with an expression that had moved a long way from its starting point. Eleanor said nothing for a long time. She was taking notes. The next 2 hours moved differently. The core problem, it turned out, had not been the deal itself. The terms were substantially compatible. Atlas Global and its international partners wanted the same things in different vocabularies. The payment phasing that had seemed like a deadlock was, in fact, a misread of what the Brazilian coalition actually required. Not a different schedule, but a different framing of the schedule that preserved a specific form of domestic political accountability that didn't translate into standard Anglo-American contract language. Daniel found the framing. The regulatory dispute with the German consortium was not a dispute about regulation. It was a dispute about who bore the risk of regulatory change, a distinction that in German engineering practice has a specific doctrinal history that shapes how contracts are written. Friedrich Baumann had been trying to say, for the better part of an hour, that his consortium needed the risk to be allocated in a way that their board of directors could explain to the Bundestag. This was not unreasonable. It was just untranslated. Daniel translated it. He also translated, with careful attention to what he was doing, the Japanese delegation's concern about project governance, specifically, the kind of multi-stakeholder oversight structure that Yuki Tanaka's principles required to satisfy internal compliance frameworks that had been redesigned after a significant infrastructure project collapse in 2019. He did not know the project. He knew the framework. He knew what governance clarity meant in this cultural context, and he knew how to help Eleanor's team offer it in terms that would land. Friedrich Baumann, at some point in the second hour, stopped checking his watch. He made the call to Frankfurt at 11:15. It was not the call he had been about to make. It was a briefing. He spoke for 4 minutes. At the end of it, he said, in German, something that Daniel translated for the room as, then he set the phone face down on the table and looked at Daniel with an expression that was as close to warmth as Friedrich Baumann probably got in a professional context. "You understand something most people with your credentials don't," Friedrich said. "I don't have credentials," Daniel said. "I know. That is what I mean." By 12:30, the framework agreement was initialed. Not signed signatures would come with lawyers and weeks and the careful machinery of formal deal-making. But the framework was there, the shape of it visible, the $3 billion that had been bleeding out of the room all morning restored to the table. Eleanor called a recess. The delegates dispersed toward refreshments that had been brought in without Daniel noticing when. Marcus reappeared at his shoulder. "You can't go back to cleaning floors today," Marcus said. It was not an order. It was a statement of fact. Daniel looked at the mop cart, still parked in the service corridor. "My shift ends at 1:30, he said. Eleanor Hayes did not use her office for conversations that mattered. She used the northeast corner of floor 50. where the windows met at an angle and the view extended all the way to the lakefront. Gray water under gray sky, the city laid out below in its permanent, indifferent magnificence. She was standing at that corner when Daniel found her, an hour after the recess had emptied the main conference room. Someone had brought him coffee that he hadn't asked for and a chair that he hadn't taken. He stood beside her, a respectful 3 feet back, and looked at the same city she was looking at. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. He hadn't mentioned Emma in the room. He thought about that for a second. 8, he said. "She'll be 9 in April. What's her name?" "Emma." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Below them, a freighter was making its slow progress through the harbor approach. She watched it. "I had a linguistics professor at Northwestern," she said. "He used to say that the most dangerous thing in international business wasn't bad faith. It was untranslated good faith." She paused. "I've been running this company for 16 years. I never entirely understood what he meant until this morning." Daniel said nothing. "Tell me what happened to you," she said, not unkindly, but with the directness of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where indirection cost money. He told her. He did not frame it as a tragedy or an injustice or a lesson, he simply told it the way it was, in the order it had occurred. Carrie's diagnosis, the treatment, the decision in the hospital waiting room, leaving Penn, getting the building management certification, the job at Atlas Global Tower because of the insurance and the hours and the school gate. He told her about learning languages on the train, about the earbuds and the verb tables and the half hour before sleep when he worked through grammar problems the way other people work through crosswords. Not because it was useful, it hadn't been useful, not until today, but because it was the one part of the life he'd imagined that he could still carry. He told her about Emma and the library book about polyglots. He laughed a little, telling it. Eleanor was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was not pity. He would have recognized pity, and he wouldn't have stayed for it. It was something more complicated, the expression of someone revising a model. "You saved this company approximately $300 million this morning," she said. "That's a conservative estimate of what falls apart if we lose the German consortium. And you did it with a mop in your hand." Daniel looked at the floor. "I just said what was there to say. That is very rarely as simple as it sounds." She turned from the window. "Atlas Global operates in 48 countries," she said. "We have translation services. We have cultural consultants. We have regional directors who speak 2, sometimes 3 languages." She paused. "What we don't have is someone who understands what language is actually for, what it does in a room, how it carries meaning that isn't in the words. Someone who can sit in a negotiation and hear the architecture of what's being said and build a bridge across it in real time." She looked at him. "I want to build something for this company," she said. "A function that doesn't really exist anywhere. Not translation, not cultural consulting, something more precise than either of those." She paused again. "I want you to build it." Daniel stood very still. This was the moment he knew it was the moment where something irreversible could happen. And the knowing of it had a specific physical quality, like standing at the edge of something and feeling the geometry of falling. "I don't have a degree," he said. "I know. I don't have a professional background in international communications, or finance, or—" "I know what you don't have," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you what you do have. And I'm telling you that what you have is rarer than what you don't." He thought about what it meant. He thought about it carefully, the way he'd learned to think about things that mattered, not with hope first. Because hope was the thing that made the drop hurt worse when it came, but with a methodical attention to what was actually in front of him. "What does the position look like?" he asked. Eleanor sat down, finally, in one of the chairs arranged near the window. She gestured to another. He sat. "Director of Global Communications," she said. "The title is accurate. You'd be building the function, which means defining what it is before you can run it. I won't pretend that's not a significant task." She paused. "Salary in the director tier, Full benefits package, enhanced, given the dependent care situation. Flexible scheduling. I'm not interested in your physical presence in this building on any particular schedule as long as the work gets done. Which, given that most of the work happens at odd hours in different time zones, probably means the schedule adapts to the work rather than the other way around. Daniel looked at his hands for a moment. The cleaning compound had dried on his right knuckle. He hadn't noticed until now. I'd need to finish my degree, he said. Eleanor nodded as if this was obvious. We have an education benefit. You'd be enrolled before the end of the month if you want to be. Penn has an online completion program for former students. I had Marcus look it up while you were finishing in the conference room. Something moved in his chest. He pressed it down, held it at arm's length, examined it for what it was. I need to talk to Emma, he said. Eleanor's expression shifted, just slightly, in a direction he hadn't expected. It's softer, for a fraction of a second. Then composed again. Of course, she said. Take the afternoon. The school was 4 stops on the Red Line and 3 blocks east, a building made of yellow brick that had been teaching children since 1931 and had the particular atmosphere of places that have absorbed a great deal of human effort, and remember it. Daniel arrived at the gate at 3:15, 7 minutes before dismissal, and stood among the other waiting parents with the strange, doubled awareness of a man who has had a day he hasn't yet processed. He saw Emma before she saw him. She was moving through the gate in the focused, purposeful way she had a small person who had decided where she was going and was getting there. Her backpack, enormous relative to her frame, her dark hair escaping its braid in the way it always did by afternoon. She was talking to her friend Lily, making a point with her hands, and then she looked up and saw him, and her face changed the way Emma's face changed when she was happy wholly, immediately, without any of the protective distance adults develop. She ran the last 20 feet. Daddy. Lily says that dolphins have names for each other, like actual names. Is that true? It might be, Daniel said, catching her. Scientists think they use signature whistles. That's a language, Emma said, with great satisfaction. He took her to the coffee shop on Leland where she always ordered hot chocolate and a cookie that was technically too large to eat in one sitting and always ate in one sitting. He watched her arrange her cookie and her backpack and her library book on the table with the organizational intensity she brought to small things, and he thought about what he was going to say and how. I want to tell you something that happened today, he said. Emma looked up. She read faces the way she read everything quickly and with attention. Something good? She asked. I think so. I'm still deciding. He told her, in the version that an 8-year-old needed, that there had been a problem at work, a big, important meeting where people couldn't understand each other, and that he had helped because he spoke their languages, and that the woman who runs the company had offered him a different kind of job because of it. Emma listened without interrupting, which was unusual. She was eating her cookie in small, precise bites, and she was looking at him with the expression she used when she was assembling information. When he finished, she said, "A job using your languages?" "Yes." "Not cleaning?" "Not cleaning." She put her cookie down. She looked at him with the full, unfiltered attention that children have before they learn to divide it. "Daddy," she said, "I knew you were the smartest person." He laughed. It was the real kind. The kind that starts in the chest and comes out before you've had a chance to moderate it. A few people at nearby tables looked over and looked away again, as people do when they've accidentally witnessed something private. "You didn't know," he said. "You hoped." Emma considered this seriously. "That's the same thing," she said. He looked at his daughter, this entirely specific person who had arrived in his life as a 9-pound fact and become, in 8 years, the most reliable argument he had that things meant something, and he thought about what it cost to wait and what it costs not to. "I'm going to take the job," he said. Emma picked up her cookie. "Obviously," she said. He called Eleanor from the coffee shop. She picked up on the second ring. "I'll take it," he said. A pause. Then, Good. Be in my office at 8 tomorrow. Not the service corridor. The main elevator. He walked Emma home through the early March dark, the city running its usual commerce around them, the lakefront wind cutting down the side streets the way it does in Chicago, when it wants to remind you it has not finished with you. Emma held his hand and talked about dolphins and signature whistles and whether fish had languages and whether, if they did, a person could learn one. Probably, Daniel said. Given enough time. How long? I don't know. Years, maybe. You'd have to be very patient. Emma considered this. I could do that, she said. He believed her. That night, after Emma was asleep, she had fallen asleep with the polyglot book open on her chest, a fact that made him stand in her doorway for longer than was strictly necessary. Daniel stood at the kitchen window and looked at the city. Chicago at night does something to itself. The grid lights up from below in amber and white. The lake sits black and enormous to the east, and from a kitchen window in Lincoln Square you can see, if you look carefully enough, the distant cluster of downtown towers where the lights burn late in the floors where decisions get made. Atlas Global Tower would be among them, floor 50, or thereabouts, the lit rectangle of a room where this morning a $3 billion deal had nearly died of untranslated good faith. He thought about the distance between that window and this one. He thought about the 11 months of service corridors, the earbuds, the verb tables on the train, the hour before sleep when he worked through grammar the way other people pray, not expecting an answer. Exactly, but keeping the practice alive because something in him had decided that the practice mattered even when it seemed to serve no function, even when he was the only one who knew it was happening. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being more than you appear to be. Daniel had lived inside it for 6 years, and he had made his peace with it, the way you make peace with things that aren't going to change. But tonight it occurred to him, standing at the kitchen window, that the peace he'd made had been a temporary accommodation, the kind you negotiate when a better option isn't visible, not a surrender, a waiting. He thought about Carrie. He allowed himself to do that. Tonight, which he didn't usually. He thought about what she would have said. She had been precise and funny and relentlessly unsentimental. A woman who believed that the universe owed nobody anything but that people owed each other everything, and she had known, in the way she had known things, that he would figure it out. She had told him that, near the end. Not in the abstract, inspirational way people say such things, but specifically, she had looked at him in that hospital room and said, "You're going to be so much more than this apartment, Daniel." And he had not been able to speak, and she had laughed, which was very Carrie. He'd been more than this apartment for about 11 hours now. He stayed at the window until the cold from the glass worked its way through. Then he went to bed. Tomorrow, the main elevator. 6 months later, the Atlas Global Cross Corridor Initiative closed. 48 countries, 17 languages. A network of infrastructure agreements that the financial press would call the most complex multi-stakeholder deal executed in the post-pandemic era. Eleanor Hayes's masterwork. Eleanor accepted the characterization graciously and gave no interviews about the Monday morning in March when it had almost ended before it began. Daniel kept the cleaning cart. Not literally, it stayed in the service corridor on the 50th floor, assigned to someone else, and he never went back to that job. But he kept it in the way you keep the things that tell you the truth about yourself, as a specific, honest memory. The thing you were doing when you decided. The Division of Cultural Intelligence, the name they eventually settled on, after 3 weeks of arguing about it, occupied a suite on the 42nd floor. 4 people to start. Daniel, a cultural anthropologist named Dr. Rebecca Simmons, whom he recruited from the University of Chicago with Eleanor's blessing, a young German-Brazilian dual citizen named Tobias Ferns, who had been working as a conference interpreter and wanted to do something that felt like it mattered, and Marcus's assistant, Clara Whitfield, who turned out to speak Polish and Ukrainian in addition to English. and had been quietly doing informal translation for the operations team for 2 years without anyone formally recognizing it. Clara's case, in particular, gave Daniel a specific kind of satisfaction. He enrolled at Penn's online completion program in April. It was strange and right in equal measure, returning to something he'd left behind under unbearable circumstances and finding that it had been patient with him, that the material was still there, that Professor Aldrich had died in 2021, but that another faculty member who had taught under her had read Daniel's old paper and sent him an email that simply said, "I wondered what happened to you. Now I know. Welcome back." He read it twice before showing it to Emma, who read it once and said, "I told you." Friedrich Baumann sent a bottle of Riesling, a card in German, which Daniel translated for Emma as, "Some people understand things that education only teaches you to ignore. You have the rare kind. Do not waste it." Emma examined the card seriously and then asked Daniel to help her write a reply, in German, thanking Herr Baumann for the kind words and noting that her father was very good, but that she was learning Spanish and intended to be better. Daniel translated it, made one minor correction to her verb form, and sent it without changing anything else. Friedrich replied within 24 hours. He said he looked forward to meeting her. The $3 billion deal was signed on a Thursday in September, in a room with no frosted glass and no service corridors, in a ceremony that took 40 minutes and was attended by 17 representatives from 12 countries. Daniel sat at the table this time. He wore a suit that Eleanor had not told him to buy but that Marcus had somehow ensured was waiting in his office on the day of. He thought about a Monday morning in March. The cart, the broom, the mop he'd named nothing, the verb tables on the train, Emma's voice on the phone. "I knew you were the smartest person." The thing about language, the thing that Daniel had spent 6 years knowing, in theory, and one morning discovering in practice, is that it is not a tool for communication. That framing is too small for what it actually does. Language is the material that meaning is made of. It is the difference between two people in the same room and two people in the same room who are also, finally, in the same conversation. In the right hands, on the right morning, it is the difference between a deal and a collapse, between a service corridor and a seat at the table, between invisible and seen.